So I'll now hand over to WYPF's actuarial team at Aon. There's Alison Murray, Sam Alborn and Eric Gibbas. So over to you three, please.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and share my slides with you all now. May take a second or two, but if you bear with me, hopefully you will now be able to see the slides on your screen. Yes?
Yep.
Excellent. Good. Okay, so just start with some introduction. So I'm Alison Murray. I'm the fund actuary at Aon. And as Caroline has mentioned, joined today on training session by Arkady, Eric, Gibas, and also Sam. And I'll let them introduce themselves as we go through. Today's session is being hosted, obviously, by West Yorkshire Pension Fund. You've just met Caroline there. They weren't sharing their photos, but we have Caroline. We also have Tracy Weaver, who's the Technical Services Manager, and Amy McHugh, who's the Employer Relations Manager. And they should be your sort of main points of contact at the fund. So in terms of the agenda, we've split it into two. We're going to start by considering ongoing participation in the fund. That's all about funding, how contributions are set. We'll talk a little bit about data requirements and other things as listed on the slide. I'm kind of conscious a couple of hours is quite a long time to be on a virtual session. So we thought we'd have a break kind of halfway through. That's kind of a natural break between the funding session and the accounting session. Come for a break, have a coffee, whatever. And then the second half will be all about accounting under IAS 19. So without further ado, we're going to start with ongoing participation in the fund, and I'm now going to pass you over to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning. My name is Arek Gibas, and before I start, I've just kind of lost the side of the slides, so I don't know whether something just happened and we stopped sharing, or is it just my problem? Can anyone see the slides?
I can't see them either, Eric. No.
No,
I can't.
Oh, yeah, the back.
Okay.
Oh yeah,
we
back. Thank you very much. I work alongside Sam and Alison advising the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. I'm also part of our public sector team accounting group, and I will start with introduction to the LGPS and the actuarial valuation of the fund. If we can move, thank you very much. Unlike other public service schemes, the LGPS is funded scheme, meaning that assets are being set aside to fund for the future benefit payments that have been promised. This requires periodic assessment of the health of the fund, which we call actuarial valuation. The key purpose of the actuarial valuation is therefore to determine the financial position of the fund and then set employer's contribution to cover the cost of the promised benefits. When we, the actuary, calculate the financial position and the employer contribution, we must have regard to the funding strategy statement, which is a document which sets the fund's policy for funding principles. A bit more about the funding valuation. Under the LGPS regulation, the valuation is required every 3 years and must be completed within 12 months. The contributions are therefore set for the period of 3 years, starting 1 year after the valuation date. For example, the contribution set as part of the 2019 valuation covered the period from 1st of April 2020 to 31st of March 2023. The results of the valuation are highly dependent on the data provided to us by the administering authority. It is therefore very important that the data provided to the fund is kind of on time and is correct. And that kind of includes the information in respect of new joiners, leavers, and any pay changes which happened Let us now move on to the next slide. Thank you very much, and talk about how the value of the liabilities is calculated. At the last valuation, which took place in 2019, we were provided with the membership data in respect of all members of the fund. And based on assumptions agreed with the administering authority, we calculated the fund's liabilities, which is the present value of the future benefit payments and to valuation date. I will explain the calculation of the liabilities in more detail in the second part of this session, which is more technical, when we talk about the pension accounting. But for now, the key assumptions used to estimate the projected future benefits payment are pension increases, pay increases, and the demographic assumptions. Once we've got the projected future benefits, we then discount those payments to the valuation date using an investment return assumption, which we call discount rate. And you can find the details of these assumptions in the valuation report, which you can find on the fund's website. Let us now talk about how we set the discount rate. So moving on to the next slide. We operate a risk-based approach to calculating the discount rate for long secure bodies, which includes academies. It's where we allow for prudence in our assumptions, which is something we require to do as actuaries. We start by looking at the assets that the fund is invested in, and using information from our investment specialist, we calculate a best estimate expected future return on those assets. By best estimate, we mean it has 50-50 chance of being borne out in practice. However, as mentioned, we need to allow for prudence, and as fund, you don't want to be in position where you only have a 50-50 chance of being able to pay benefits for members of the scheme. So we look at a number of different scenarios with varying probability of funding success. Having considered those scenarios, the fund opted to adopt a 75% probability of funding success at the 2019 valuation, which means that based on our calculation, there is a 75% chance of having enough money to meet the benefits in future, whilst also keeping contribution affordable for employers. All other assumptions, which I've mentioned before, the pension increase, the salary, and the demographic assumptions are best estimate, so they have the 50-50 chance of being borne out in practice. Let's move on to discuss some key results of the 2019 valuation and how they've been presented. As part of the 2019 valuation, we produce individual employer result schedule for each academy or a multi-academy trust, which set out the key information, data, and results from the valuation. On the right, we have a printout of the of the results schedule, which we produce as part of the valuation. The schedule sets out information about the employer, so it includes the funding target. In case of the academies, this is the schedule and subsumption body funding target. Sometimes when we talk about sometimes for the purpose of the actuarial valuation, when we talk about the funding target, we kind of often exchange it with the liabilities. So when we say funding target, we sometimes kind of refer to it as the liabilities as well, which I've mentioned before. The results schedule also summarized the key results, which were the value of assets, the value of the liabilities, surplus or shortfall, and the funding level. We talk a bit about the asset and liabilities. When we look at the funding level is simply the ratio of the assets to the liabilities. And it's a quick measure to tell us whether the fund is well funded or not that well funded. So if anything above 100% means that the fund's got more assets than the liabilities at that point in time. The surplus or shortfall is calculated as the difference between the asset and the liabilities. So hence, there is a shortfall when the liabilities are greater than the assets, and a surplus when we've got more assets than the liabilities. If there is a deficit, then additional contribution will need to be paid into the fund by the employers. And if there is a surplus, then the contribution are able to be reduced to pay back the surplus to employers. The schedule which we provide as part of the valuation also set out contribution information. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll talk about them a bit more. Thank you. The contribution that are calculated as part of the valuation broadly cover two elements. The primary contribution are to cover benefits which will build up in future, whereas the secondary contribution are an adjustment to allow for any surplus or deficit in the fund, as I mentioned before. Secondary contribution could be paid as an amount or as a percentage of members' pay. So looking at the results schedule on the right of this slide, this set out the information about the current contribution, which is at the top or on the right, which were the contributions set as part of the previous valuation, which took place in 2016 and were payable by the employers during the year ending 31st of March 2020. We then show summary of contribution calculated as part of the 2019 valuation. That's the middle section on the right, followed by the proposed contribution, which would have been paid or certified as part of the 2019 valuation over the period of 3 years. You will note that in the example on this slide, the current contribution is lower than the contribution calculated at the 2019 valuation, and that the proposed contribution are designed to gradually increase from the current contribution level or the kind of the previous contribution level to the new contribution. In other words, the increase in contribution is smoothed out over a number of years. And to which we refer the stepping period to ensure that they can be afforded by the employers. I will now talk a bit more about other factors which affect the contribution setting. So if we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. These factors can be categorized into two groups. On the left, we have the factors which are driven by the funding strategy statement and the funding principles and are the same for all academies. And on the right, we have factors which are largely driven by the employer's membership profile, and they're kind of dependent on each of the employers. So we start on the left. We have the level of prudence used when deriving the discount rate, which we already talked about a bit, which for academies is the same as for the main councils. Then we have other assumptions used to calculate the liabilities, which are the same for all employers in the fund. And finally, we've got the recovery period, which is the period over which any surplus or shortfall is eliminated. And for academies, this is the same as for the main councils. And on the right, we have the factors driven by the employer, and we start with the membership profile. So for example, the average age of active members, depending on whether it's high or low, it impacts on the primary contribution rate. Then we take into account the position at the last valuation and the contribution paid since the last valuation. And this impacts on the level of asset which the employer will have on the valuation, and hence impacts the secondary contribution. And the last is the experience since last valuation. And by experience, we mean any pay increases, number of leavers, retirements, and deaths which happen in between the valuation. And those factors generally can affect both the primary and the secondary contribution rate. It is due to these employer-led factors that the contribution set as part of the 2019 valuation varied by academy trust or academy or multi-academy trust. So we discussed the valuation process and the valuation results. I will now talk a bit what's happened to the fund since the 2019 valuation, where we find ourselves after over 2 years. And you will all note that these were very odd 2 years that we certainly wouldn't have predicted. This is the overriding development over the period since the 2019 valuation. There is quite a lot going on here, and it's quite small, so I'll explain what the chart is showing. This chart is not the West Yorkshire specific, but it shows typical returns on different asset classes over the period since the 2019 valuation, with each colored line representing an asset class. As you would expect, a line trending upwards from left to right indicates an increase in assets over the period. So looking at the chart, returns were doing really well for the first 11 months after the 2019 valuation, as evidenced by the lines trending upwards on the chart. But then, as you are all more than aware, things kind of went a bit south around March of last year, and the chart shows that with the big drop around that time. Since then, assets have actually recovered really well, especially overseas equities. That's the orange line on the top, and overall returns are above what we expected at the 2019 valuation. So for the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, despite the drop in March 2020, asset returns have been around 20% from the 2019 valuation to the end of June 2021. We would have only expected around 10% based on the discount rate of 4.35% per year used for the 2019 valuation. So asset returns have outperformed the expected liability increases and led to an increase in the funding position of around 10% since the 2019 valuation based on asset returns alone. However, you will note that there is a drop towards the end of September across all asset classes. And this just sends a message that we are still some 6 months away from the 2022 valuation date, and a lot can happen in between now and the valuation and the next valuation date. So this is just a warning to be cautious. Let's check what's happened to the key assumptions over this period. Okay. Using the same approach as at the 2019 valuation, so still using the 75% probability of funding success and allowing for Aon's investment team's view, the financial outlook is not the same as at 31st of March 2019. And so we have updated our assumptions at the end of June 2021, and which is the last quarter we have the data for. This does actually lead to the same discount rate as at the valuation date of 4.35%, but we believe that long-term CPI is likely to be slightly higher than assumed at the 2019 valuation. So this assumption has increased from 2.1 percent at the valuation, at the 2019 valuation, to 2.2% at the 31st of June 2021. This results in a reduction in the real discount rate, which is the difference between the discount rate and the CPI assumption, which means that we expect liabilities to be slightly higher than previously assumed. And this alone reduces the funding position by around 2%. Note that we haven't made any changes to our demographic assumptions, and I'll talk a bit more about the mortality and the impact of COVID later on, but for the purpose of these updates, we have not changed those assumptions. If we now move to the next slides, this slide sets out the impact of the changes in asset and the liabilities on the whole of fund position and total contribution rate. So effectively allowing for these two key changes, change in the asset and change in the liabilities I've just mentioned, the funding level has improved from 106% at the 2019 valuation to 113% at the end of June 2021, an increase of 7%, which is broadly in line with the 10% increase due to asset, less the 2% decrease due to change in assumptions, which I've mentioned before. The surplus has increased from 866 million at the valuation to little under 2 billion at the end of June 2021. And as mentioned in the last few slides, this is a result of large increase in asset values, which have only been partly offset by changing our assumptions used to calculate the liabilities. As mentioned before, the assets have dropped at the end of September. So the current position might be a little lower. Looking at the contribution, the primary contribution have increased from 18.9% of pay to 19.5% of pay for the whole of fund. This was mainly driven by the increase in the CPI assumption. I will now pass on to Alison to talk about things that might help to keep the contribution stable at the next valuation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So firstly, obviously, it's great that things are looking positive, even if there are some headwinds, as Eric suggested, in relation to what's happened since the end of June. We also think that perhaps the pension increase that will be due next April might be a little bit higher than our assumption. We'll know once CPI to the end of September has been published. But just a kind of a reminder, really, that when we're thinking about funding, particularly for employers such as yourselves, who we expect will be in the fund for a long time, perhaps indefinitely, and we are very much looking to take a long-term view. So really the purpose of this slide is just really to make it very clear that you should not be getting too excited and budgeting for sort of contribution reductions. It's a little bit too early to say, you know, given the valuation date is some 6 months away still. But if the position were as positive at the end of March next year as it is at the end of June this year, we might suggest or recommend that West Yorkshire take a number of steps to effectively kind of fix the roof while the sun shines. So for example, things like perhaps being a little bit more prudent, maybe pushing up that probability of funding success for 75%. Perhaps actually instead saying, well, it's great that we've got such a good funding position, but we're not going to let contributions reduce to take full account of that surplus. Let's keep a little bit back. You know, we've got things like, you know, we don't really know yet what the effect of Brexit is going to be. There do seem to be sort of headwinds in the economy generally. So let's not give employers full credit for the surplus. Let's keep a bit back. We could, as some funds certainly did at the 2019 valuation, just say, as a matter of principle, we're not going to reduce contributions. You know, as Eric's indicated, the primary rate, the cost of benefits being accrued in future, is going up. So let's just keep contributions where they are. There's another other potential approaches that we've summarised on this slide. And I think the key message is all of those approaches actually were adopted by some funds that were very well funded at the 2019 valuation. And it's not the case that we're trying to force employers to overpay. I think the key thing goes back to the point Eric made about what we did in 2019 about stepping up contribution increases. If we're in a position where contributions could reduce, ideally we would take steps to try and smooth any reductions. I think stability of contributions is going to be a key aim at the 2022 valuation, and we'll have a bit more information about that once we've actually done some of the numbers. But for the purposes of today, I think the key message is things are looking quite positive. There will be quite material variation between employers for the reasons that Eric has indicated. You're all in a slightly different position. But certainly please don't start thinking you're going to get huge contribution reductions, because that won't be the plan when we come to do the valuation. And just one of the other things that's quite academy specific, some multi-academy trusts are treated as a single employer for contribution rate purposes, and then so you've all the academies in that trust pay the same contribution rate. Alternatively, I'm aware that some multi-academy trusts, each academy is treated as a separate employer. So West Yorkshire does offer flexibility from that point of view, but what you can't have is a mix and match. So if a new academy joins a multi-academy trust, it must be treated in the same way as the existing academies in that multi-academy trust in terms of either paying the MAT contribution rate or its own individual contribution rate. So I think that is the kind of end of our first subsection, all about sort of funding and setting contributions. I know it's been quite a lot to take in, but before we move on, does anybody have any immediate questions that they would like to ask? You can either unmute yourself and ask it, or there is also, I think, a chat function if you want to type anything into the chat box, and we'll try and pick those up as we go through anyway. So I'll just pause for a second just to check if anyone has any burning questions at this point. Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. As I say, if something comes to mind later on, please do pop a question in the chat box. Okay, so moving on, hopefully you can still see my screen. Our second section then relates to data and other requirements. So I'm going to start with some new regulations that came in. So historically, you could only change employer contributions for long-term employers such as yourselves once every 3 years when you're doing a formal valuation. In September 2020, regulations came in which changed that and made a number of changes which we call employer flexibilities. And I want to talk a little bit about those. The regulations came in September, but you were only able to make use of the flexibilities if you had published a policy on how you would deal with them. And in order to publish that policy, you had to have regard to statutory guidance, which didn't actually appear for a number of months. So cutting a long story short, West Yorkshire does have a policy for how it will implement these new flexibilities, which came in April this year. And there were 3 elements to these flexibilities. Firstly, the circumstances in which the fund may review an employer's contributions between valuations. And just to be clear, it is not intended, this was clear in the regulations and in the policy, it is not intended that contributions should be amended because market conditions have changed. So anybody getting excited about what Eric's just presented, you can't come to the fund and say, well, actually, we see the funding level's gone up, we'd like a contribution reduction now, thank you. That is not what the flexibilities are intended for. It's principally around employer activity, where there's been a material change in the membership or the financial strength for the non-tax raising bodies of the employer. The other two changes are really to do with employers leaving the fund. So I'm hoping that's not going to be particularly relevant to you as academies, so I'm not going to talk about those. But the reason I mention this in particular is that the employer flexibilities and the ability to review contributions between valuation does have implications in terms of the extent to which you need to keep the fund informed of these kinds of changes. And alongside the changes to the funding strategy statement, the fund also updated its pension administration strategy. And we've introduced this framework, which we've called notifiable events. We've sort of pinched the terminology from the private sector because there have been for some time long established requirements for corporates, employers to advise trustees of various types of corporate activity that may influence their ability to make contributions to the pension fund. So for West Yorkshire purposes, these are the notifiable events on slide 18 here, which may trigger a review of employer contributions. There are a number of them, and as you can perhaps see, some of them are related to things like the employer's financial strength, breaching banking covenants, that sort of thing. The two things I think that are likely to be relevant to academies in particular are firstly, if an employer takes a decision to restrict its active membership in future. Technically, as academies, you should be auto-enrolling all your employees that don't qualify for the teachers' pension scheme into the local government pension scheme, the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. I'm not aware that any of the West Yorkshire academies have done this, but I do know that one or two academies in other places have set up wholly owned companies, and they don't always participate fully in the LGPS. So it shouldn't be the case. But if there were a decision that you take that suggested that there would be a reduction in the number of active members joining, you absolutely need to tell West Yorkshire Pension Fund. You also need to make sure it's allowed in terms of the LGPS regulations, but that would be the sort of thing that might trigger a review of contributions, because the calculations that we carry out that Arik took you through assume that you will continue to add new members to the fund so that your profile of membership stays stable over time. I think probably of most relevance is the second one on the slide here. If there is a restructuring or other event that could materially affect your membership. And in the context of academies and multi-academy trusts, I think that's most likely to be if there were a significant new academy trust joining the multi-academy trust. So in particular, if the contributions for your multi-academy trust are set at the MAT level, so you've only got one contribution, and a very big new academy joined, such that actually changed the overall profile of the membership of the MAT, that might be something that would trigger a review of your contributions before the next valuation. Conversely, if one or more academies were to leave a multi-academy trust, again, that might trigger a review of contributions. So these are the sorts of events that you need to make sure you tell the pensioner fund about, ideally before they happen, but certainly once they do happen, so that the fund can decide whether or not there should be a change in contributions. But that's quite a sort of specific area. Clearly, you have much wider obligations to the fund in terms of the information that you need to provide about your employees and former employees. And Arik's going to give you a little bit more information on your responsibilities in that area.
Thank you, Alison. So here we just got a summary of the things which you as the scheme employer should do or must provide to the pension fund. And from our perspective, in terms of the things we kind of need to calculate the position at the valuation, we would kind of encourage that each employer provide all the relevant information to the fund as soon as possible after the event, which then kind of allows us to take it into account in a timely manner. The second point is to provide year-end information in respect of all the members. again, as soon as possible, and that includes leaver forms, pay details, provide year-end information in respect of all members, including new joiners and leavers. And then the key as well is to kind of the deduction and payment over of the contribution, and this is both in respect of the member contribution and the employee contribution. And that's the kind of key points from our perspective as the actuaries. But there are other things which are shown on the slide which you also need to do. And there's kind of one point as well to kind of remind everyone that if you use an outsource payroll provider, so if someone else does your payroll for you, the responsibility still remains with you to ensure that the data is provided to the fund. So just kind of remember and bear that in mind. I will now talk a bit more about the kind of importance of the good data from the kind of valuation perspective. Thank you, Alison. So by providing accurate and timely data, you kind of ensure that the right benefits are paid to the right people, and also that we, the actuaries, are provided with the correct data for our valuation, so that when we calculate which kind of enables us to calculate the correct amount of money to be set aside to pay for all these benefits promised to members. And that in turn results in us setting the correct contribution for all the employers, and that kind of affects you. To help us with our evaluation, please provide the correct data to the fund on time, including the leaver forms, which often can be kind of forgotten as the members are no longer employed. However, from the fund perspective, these members are still your responsibility. To help you fulfill your role, and the fund provides support by offering free training sessions. So if we move to the next slide, we've listed them all here to kind of show you what's there. So these are all the upcoming training sessions provided by the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. All sessions are free, and each session lasts approximately 30 minutes and can be booked via the link which is on the slide. In addition, there is a number of pre-recorded webinars on the fund's website, and all the links to booking the training sessions and to the pre-recorded webinars will be sent out to you with the feedback form after the session. I will now again pass to Alison so that she can talk about the kind of exciting topic of outsourcing. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Eric. Just before I go on to the next session, just to pick up on one of the questions we've had through the chat box. When I was talking about the event that you should notify the administering authority of, I was, thinking of the quite significant ones, but I've very rightly been asked, so what about a general restructuring within an individual academy? And I would say that is definitely something that the administering authority would be interested in. If it were an academy in particular that has its own contribution rate, that could result in the need to change its contributions. It may be less likely to lead to a contribution change if it's one academy within a multi-academy trust, where the multi-academy trust has the contribution rate. But either way, please do err on the side of telling the pension fund about such events, even if it doesn't actually lead to a review of contributions. So I just thought it was worth just clarifying that, because I thought it was a good question. And before we move on to the next session on outsourcing, if there are any other questions, please do feel free to feed those in. Otherwise, we will just move on. Okay, I'm kind of conscious of time too, so let me, as Eric says, get onto this exciting topic. So if I can start with, well, what do we actually mean by outsourcing? So this is where effectively you employ a third party, a private sector provider to deliver services, and there's then a compulsory transfer of staff. As I hope you're all aware, new fair deal, it's not that new, it's been in place since October 2013, but we still call it new fair deal, does apply to academies, central government bodies. And it provides protection for staff who are compulsorily, if I can say the word, transferred. It means that the contractor, the private sector provider that you're commissioning to provide the services must participate in the local government pension scheme in the West Yorkshire Pension Fund as an admission body. Admission bodies are employers, sometimes short-term employers, that participate via an admission agreement, which sort of sets out the contractual arrangements which govern their participation in the fund. And the process should be that if you are considering letting a contract and outsourcing services, you should let West Yorkshire know in advance. You should identify who might be transferred and ask for information from the fund on what that might mean for pensions. So, for example, what contribution rate might be payable and a risk assessment, which I'll come on to. You should also think about the pensions aspects in terms of what will happen at the end of the contract. Would you, as the letting authority, expect to take responsibility for the liabilities that have built up for the members whilst they were employed by the contractor? And really importantly, you should ensure that you and the contractor sign the admission agreement, which, as I say, governs the participation of the contractor in the fund. And West Yorkshire, the administering authority, will also sign that admission agreement. And I think that the key things that I want you to take away from this is that as the letting authority, so you are the one for whom the contractor is providing services, you are responsible for adhering to fair deal, and you are responsible for ensuring the admission agreement is in place and advising the fund. The fact that in some cases the staff may be transferring from one of the councils does not absolve you of that responsibility. It is still your responsibility as the employer awarding the contract. And due to, I think, a proliferation, shall we say, of small short-term contracts, largely outsourcings from employers like yourselves from academies, we, or West Yorkshire, introduced a new sort of default approach with effect from April, which we called sort of pass-through sort of pooling. And the reason really we did that is that actually, there's quite a lot of actuarial calculations involved when a new contractor joins. We have to calculate the contribution rate, the transfer of assets between the council or whoever's employing the staff and the new contractor, and also the risk assessment. And there's quite a lot of potential cost associated with that. And when it's a short-term contract, we also have to do calculations when it comes to an end. So in order to try and make the process a bit smoother, a bit easier, a bit cheaper, this new pass-through pooling approach was implemented. So if you, as the letting authority, do not make specific different agreement with the contractor, this default will apply. What it means is that the contractor will pay the same contribution rate as the letting authority. We won't set the contractor up for funding purposes as a separate employer. We'll effectively treat it as if it's still part of the academy or multi-academy trust. So there's no additional work associated with that. And it means that when the contractor leaves, the assets and liabilities would stay again with the academy or the multi-academy trust. And it's the default approach where there's fewer than 100 members involved and the contract length is less than 5 years. And as I say, it's about simplifying the sort of administration from the funding perspective and saving costs. However, despite that, there is still this regulatory requirement that exists, which requires the admission body, slightly strangely, to carry out a risk assessment on premature termination of the contract due to insolvency or administration. So the legislative requirement sits with the admission body, but importantly, that risk assessment has to be carried out to the satisfaction of both the fund and you, the Multi-Academy Trust, the Academy, as the letting authority. which is, in my view, a slightly odd situation, but that's what the regulations say. So that's the kind of who. Then if the risk assessment is such as to require it, the contractor, the admission body, has to get an indemnity or bond in an approved form. And there's just a list of those providers that basically qualify as approved providers in terms of the regulations. So what generally happens to make that process easier, rather than the admission body going off and commissioning a risk assessment, coming to the fund and the letting authority say, "Oh, is this satisfactory?" and them saying, "Well, no, actually it's not." What generally happens is that as the fund actuary, we would carry out the risk assessment. We would carry out the calculations in line with West Yorkshire's policy, and that can be shared with yourselves as letting authority and the admission body, in order to enable you to determine if that risk assessment meets your needs. And there are different ways in which we can carry out those calculations. So unfortunately, apologies, there's lots of jargon associated with pensions, but in terms of how we articulate it, we would generally say, so you could have an assessment of the primary bond, and or the secondary bond. And by primary bond, we really mean if the contractor became insolvent and all the staff were made redundant, what would the additional cost be of those members of staff over age 55 potentially being entitled to an immediate pension, an early retirement with no reduction, what we call the strain cost. So that tends to be the primary bond calculation. We can also do calculations of the secondary bond. That can relate to whether there's any surplus or shortfall in the contractor's portion of the fund, things like extra administration costs. What if the contractor left and became insolvent and hadn't paid its contributions? So we make an allowance for that. And what if in future markets go pear-shaped and you know, the past service position materially worsens, so you know the surplus either disappears or the shortfall increases. So those are the sorts of calculations that we will carry out. What we don't do, we don't say, well, we've done a huge covenant analysis of this contractor and we think it's X% likely the contractor will become insolvent. What our calculations are doing is, if the employer was insolvent, here are the amounts that might be owed to the fund by way of strain costs and these other things that I've listed. And then if a bond or indemnity is required, then the insurance company or the provider would then figure out how much that cover would cost to put in place. And you can find further information on the regulatory requirements in the LGPS regulations, and I've got the link there for you. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I know this can be quite a difficult area for employers. So before we move on to our final session, if anybody has any immediate comments or questions, then again, as ever, this is your chance to ask them. And if you think about any in the break, obviously, when we come to that, please do fire them in. So now then on to the final session of this first half, which is about topical issues. And I'm going to hand back to Eric to take you through a couple of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Since the actuaries, we like to talk about mortality. So if we move to the next slide, we set this assumption at the valuation based on the standard tables produced by the continuous mortality investigation, in short CMI, which is part of the actuarial profession. We then take account of experience of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund to set the fund specific mortality assumptions. We then keep these assumptions unchanged between valuation unless there is a large change in expected future mortality rates. The hot topic on mortality this year, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. The impact that this has had on mortality rates and what this might mean for future longevity. looking to the impact of the COVID-19 section of this slide, the main difference between this information and what you will see on, say, BBC News is that these figures are based on information produced by the CMI. What they are doing is looking at excess deaths over the period above what they would expect based on mortality in previous years. So not just COVID-19 deaths. The information they have released suggests that to the end of August 2021, there were around 92,500 excess deaths compared with what would have been expected over the period of the pandemic. If we look at the chart on the right, this shows the mortality rates in 2020 and 2021. Represented by the light blue and the dark blue lines, and 2019 represented by the orange line or the kind of slightly yellowish. It also shows gray bars to represent the spread of rates over the period between 2011 to 2019. You can see that mortality rates really spiked during Q2 of the 2020, where the light blue line is way above the average for that period, and also early in 2021, where the dark blue line is above the average. But rates were otherwise at similar levels, if not even lower than in the previous years. There is some small good news in that flu death levels are expected to have been much lower over this winter than in previous winters. Typically, there are around 15,000 deaths from flu every year, with that amount varying according to the severity of the flu season, with almost 30 deaths in the 2014-15 season and around 4 in 2018-19. But given social distancing, hand washing, lockdown, and greatly reduced travel, there has been much less likelihood of flu and other illnesses being spread compared to previous years. So our Aon's view is that it's really too soon to say how the pandemic will impact on future mortality rates. We would note that there may be some upsides from the pandemic, which result in fewer deaths in future, such as more importance being placed on hygiene, as I have already mentioned, and the possibility that the remaining population could be healthier on average following the pandemic and living for longer. Although the effects of the pandemic aren't just directly on the individual's health, and so the wider effects on people's finances, for example, could have an impact on future mortality rates as well. So it's all a very complex issue. CMI share a similar view, and so in their latest longevity improvement model, CMI 2020, they've elected to exclude the impact of deaths over 2020 from their calculations. So if we move to the next slide, which is quite wordy and there's quite a lot of information on, so I won't talk through them all, but these are some findings from a study that our team at Aon carried out in respect of one of our other LGPS funds. We found that whilst deaths were much higher than expected over the year to the end of February 2021, about 15% higher. In terms of the impact on liabilities, this was actually very small, representing around 0.2% of pensioners' liability. So assuming that the average fund has under half of pensioner liabilities, that's less than a 0.1% reduction in the total fund liabilities as a result of the COVID deaths. That's generally this is generally as a result of the profile of the individuals who have died, and us having already anticipated deaths in our calculation. This wasn't out of line with the national data on deaths rates, and whilst it's not necessarily indicative of the experience of other funds, including West Yorkshire Pension Fund, it would be surprising if other funds were seeing a material impact from the COVID-19 deaths. So the message is that, yeah, there shouldn't be a significant impact due to the COVID pandemic on the liabilities. I will now pass on to Alison to cover other topical issues.
Thank you, Eric. So just one or two things before we wrap up this first session. Any of you involved in accounting, and we're coming on to that after our break, may well be aware of the MCLEOD Sargent judgment. So just by way of reminder for those of you who maybe aren't, when the scheme, the LGPS in England Wales, was reformed in 2014, one of the elements of that reform was that there was protection given to those who were within 10 years of normal pension age on the 1st of April 2012. Those members effectively got sort of better of both promise, what we call the final salary underpin. So you would compare the previous benefits, the 1/60th of final pay as the final salary benefit, with the 1/49th new career average pay, whichever gave you the better benefit, that would be what they would get. That then was challenged. There were two cases: the MCLEOD case, which was related to the judges' pension scheme, the Sargent case related to the firefighters' pension scheme. It was challenged on the basis that it constituted unlawful age discrimination. The government lost the case and decided, I think rightly, that it would treat the judgment as affecting all of the public service pension schemes, including the LGPS. And as a result, we have changes expected. We have the Public Service Pensions Bill, which implements some of the changes at a kind of very high level across all of the public service schemes. That's currently going through Parliament. It's had its second reading, I think, in the House of Lords committee stage this month. Following which we will get final LGPS regulations to implement the changes to remove this unlawful age discrimination. But they are not expected until the 1st of April 2023. And I've put on slide 29 here the sort of proposals that government put forward as part of the sort of draft regulations for the LGPS. So effectively, it boils down to there being a new underpin, that the extent of the underpin is slightly different to the existing one. Clearly, it's not age related in any way. So I won't go into the details of it, but it does require additional data to be collected, because what's now going to happen is for this new underpin period, which is from the date the career average scheme came in, the 1st of April 2014, to the end of the period, which is going to be the 31st of March 2022, then funds will have to check whether anybody who left in that period would have been entitled to this new underpin. So they're going to have to do a comparison of the final salary benefits and the career average benefits, which they probably didn't expect to do previously if they hadn't been within 10 years of pension age on April 2012. So West Yorkshire, like lots of other funds, has started that data collection process. So this is just really a plea from me. If you haven't yet submitted that data, please do so, because you are, as employers, critical to that data collection process. On slide 30, I'm not going to go through all of this. The intention really behind having all these various things is just really to let you know just how much is going on in relation to the LGPS, public service pensions, pension schemes in general. A couple of things maybe of interest to you as academies. Firstly, the Section 13 report. What on earth is that? So this is something that the Government Actuaries Department does every 3 years. Under Section 13 of the Public Service Pensions Act, they do a report on all of the local funding valuations, including, of course, the West Yorkshire Pension Fund valuation. And in their report on the 2016 valuations, they included some comments on how academies were treated for funding purposes, and that perhaps different things were being done in different parts of the country, etc. And nothing really came of that, but of course they are working their way through the report on the 2019 valuations. We've seen a draft, we've had some discussions with them, delighted that the West Yorkshire Pension Fund gets a clean bill of health, but I mention it here because we think that there will again be commentary in relation to academies and how they are treated for funding purposes. And we've also started having discussions nationally, including representatives from the Department for Education. So we don't yet know what it's going to mean. It's just a heads up that there may be changes afoot. There may be, again, more of a spotlight on how academies are treated. And obviously, we will work with West Yorkshire on that. And if there are to be any changes, we will let you know. Lots of other things going on here. By all means, ask questions about them. But I think that was the main one. And also the exit cap. You may be aware that there was an abortive attempt to include a cap on total exit payments when public service workers left their employment. That came in and withdrawn. We are expecting it to be reintroduced before the end of this year. I'm not sure if the timing is going to change due to the rebranding of MCLEOD and whether that's going to lead, Michael Gove becoming Secretary of State, whether that may lead to a delay. But the exit cap itself was very much a Treasury initiative. So just be aware that that may well be coming back if you have any redundancies or other things in the pipeline. And then just to wrap up, just sort of focusing on the funding implications, some of the potential legislative changes. Just to let you know, when we did the 2019 valuation, we knew MCLEOD was coming. We didn't know precisely what the remedy, the new underpin, would look like, but we did make an allowance in the 2019 valuation. We hope to refine that allowance at the 2022 valuation, and we may make it a bit more employer specific. We took quite a broad brush approach at 2019. So that's something that we'll be doing as part of the 2022 valuation. But I should just say that MCLEOD will have a much bigger impact in terms of administration. The cost for the administering authority of actually putting in place this new underpin, I think that's the far bigger issue than what it does to your liabilities, because it's not going to be a big windfall for members. But nevertheless, we will need to allow for that. And there's a couple of other changes in legislation. The GMP one, that's guaranteed minimum pensions. We have now got a resolution to that. We think it will increase liabilities by 0.1, 0.2% at whole of fund level. Again, it will vary by employer, but nothing to get too excited about. And in another discrimination case, this time in the teachers' pension scheme, we are expecting, they're not there yet, we're expecting similar changes to widowers' pensions in the LGPS, which might increase liabilities by 0.2 to 0.3 at a kind of a whole of fund level. We didn't allow for that in the 2019 valuation, so it's something that might push up the liabilities very slightly in 2022. And finally, we've talked a lot about the 2022 valuation. So just to give you a bit of a sense of the timetable for that, we're already starting doing some preparation. Eric, I think, mentioned that we do an analysis of the experience of what's happened to all the members. That's the demographic experience for the fund, and we use that to form the assumptions. We'll be doing that later this year. We've already planned to do an analysis of the quality of the data based on data to the 31st of March 2021. That will be reported back to West Yorkshire, and they will then follow that up with any sort of problem employers. So please do ensure that you continue to provide data on time and it's good quality. And things like leaver forms are really very important. Just because they've left your employment, they still have benefits in the scheme that we need to know about, and we need to make sure that our valuation calculations accurately reflect the status of employees. But as we've mentioned, the valuation date is still some months away. We won't get data for another, well, hopefully less than a year, but it'll be, towards the second half of next year before we actually have the valuation membership data. So we won't be running results for about 12 months or so. And we do the whole fund results, then we focus on employer results. So we hope that all the employer results will be available by the end of January 2023. with time for the valuation to be signed off at the end of March, and contributions coming in from 2023. So just one final thing, it is a really big exercise, the valuation, and we all do need to work together to make sure it's as smooth as possible, so you get your results earlier to help with your budgeting and everything else. So the more you can engage with the fund in terms of providing the data, inevitably then the quicker you can get the results, because what sometimes hold results up is if we find that actually the new data we've got isn't consistent what we had at the last valuation, and then we have to do investigations and what have you. So please, if you can provide decent quality data as soon as you can, that actually will help you in terms of the numbers being more accurate, and potentially you will get them earlier. So any questions, or shall we move to the break? I'm sure you're all desperate for a coffee. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through on the chat. So I'm conscious we're running slightly over time, so maybe if we can keep the coffee break to certainly no more than 10 minutes. So maybe come back at 11:19 if that's acceptable to everybody. I'm not expecting everyone to suddenly start unmuting themselves and telling me that, so I think we're going to assume that that is okay. So thank you for your attention and for your questions, and we will be back in, well, 9 minutes now. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's 11:19 by my watch, so we'll start the second session then, I think. So welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me and see the slides on the screen. This second half of the session is about accounting. So, excuse me, my name's Sam Ogborn. I'm an actuary working alongside Alison and Eric, advising the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, and I also sit on the public sector team accounting group at Aon, which develops the accounting services for all LGPS employers across all of our clients. So Eric's going to talk through the first part of this session, but before he does, I'll just talk through what we're going to cover. So we'll start with an introduction to pensions accounting, which includes a back to basics look at how we measure liabilities and the differences to the funding approach, which is used to set contributions at actuarial valuations. We'll then run through the main pension costs and disclosure items that you need to show in your accounts before moving on to some hot topics this year, including assumptions at this year end and some recent national developments. We'll then finish this session with an overview of how accounting positions have moved over the year and what we expect auditors to be looking at this year. So over to you then, Eric, to talk through an introduction to pensions accounting.
Thank you, Sam. Welcome again. I hope you enjoyed the first part of the training where we talk about the funding valuation. I will now talk about the pension accounting valuation in more detail and also cover how the liabilities are calculated. So if we move to the next slide, please. Our starting point for the accounting figures is the result of the latest triennial actuarial valuation of the fund, which we talked before. So that's the latest one is 2019 valuation. In the first part of the training, as I explained, I kind of talked about the balance sheet, where on one side we have the employer's notional share of the fund's asset, and on the other side we have the value of the liabilities, which in accounting language is called the defined benefit obligation. As part of the valuation, we also explained that we calculate a cost of future benefits, which we call the primary rate. And this is expressed as a percentage of pay, which is based on the profile of the active membership. We talked about the valuation being a significant exercise and it taking a year to finalize the work. So the accounting standards allow us to use approximations to calculate the accounting costs between the valuation by making adjustment to the results of the last full valuation. And this is known as a roll forward method. The example on the right of this slide shows how the 31st of August 2020 figures were a roll forward of the 2019 valuation results. The 2021 figures are a roll forward from the 2020 results, and the 2022 results will be roll forward from the 2021 results. When preparing the next set, the 2023 accounting results, we will use the results of the new valuation, in this case, the 2022 valuation. So when updating the results of a new valuation, we may see a correction to the pension cost and a step change in the reported position, which many employers will have seen last year. Now, we thought it would be helpful to the rest of this accounting training session if we spend a little time running through how we calculate the liabilities when we kind of do the triennial valuation, which I've kind of promised you in the first part of the training. So if we move to the next slide, please. Thank you, Sam. Firstly, let us consider one member of the fund. If he has 1 year of service and a salary of 20,000 over the year, then he has earned a pension of 1/49 of salary, which is 408. per annum. And let's assume this is payable from age 65. So that's what you see on the slide. The pension will increase in line with the inflation both before and after the retirement and will be payable until the member dies, following which a spouse pension may be payable. So the chart simply shows a projected cash flow profile for this one member. Moving on to the next slide, we then need to make this projection across all members of each employer to build up a cash flow profile, a cash flow projection of all future benefit payments. And a typical cash flow chart will start at the level of the current pensioner payroll and then increase gradually over time as more and more people retire and start drawing a pension and taking cash at retirement. And then in the longer term, the level of payments will reduce and pensioners die and fewer beneficiaries remain in the scheme. It's probably worth pointing out that the graph shown is kind of excludes the future accruals, which will then kind of build up and could continue into the future. You will now know that in order to calculate this cash flow, we need to make some assumptions about the future. So let's talk a bit more about what assumptions do we need to make when calculating this cash flow. So when we move to the next slide, here we summarize the main assumptions. The blue hexagons are the financial assumptions, which we talk a bit about in the first section. And these affect the size of the benefits, the rate at which the benefits increase into the future. So including CPI inflation and future salary increases for members. The gray hexagons are the demographic assumptions, and these affect the timing of when benefits are paid. The most significant of these assumptions is the mortality, which we covered before, but they also include a number of other assumptions around things like the likelihood of taking ill health retirement, the probability that the member will have a spouse or a partner on death, and how much pension member will exchange for a tax-free lump sum on retirement. So only a few examples. So we've talked about the discount rate, which is used to calculate the present value of the future cash flow. And this is illustrated in a bit more detail on the next slide. So for now, if we return to our first example of the individual member, we are trying to calculate how much money we think we need today to pay the future expected cash flows. And in this example, we've calculated that we would need around 18,000 at the age of 65 in order to meet the cash flows from that date. However, we don't need to set aside the full 18,000 today to meet those cash flows because we expect to earn investment returns on our money between now and then. So if we expect to earn an investment return of around 3% per annum, then we would only need to set aside 10,000 now. So just over half of what we think is needed at age 65. However, if we expect a higher investment return of 4% per annum between now and then, we would only need to set aside 8,200. And if we assume an investment return is even higher, say 5% per annum, then we only need to set aside 6,800. So you can see relatively small changes in our assumption for the future investment returns can have a significant impact on the value we place on those benefits in today's terms. It's an inverse relationship. So the lower the discount rate, the investment return, the higher the estimated cost of providing the benefits. So when the discount rate goes down, the cost goes up. Let's now move on to the next slide and talk about a bit the assumptions. The current accounting standards are prescriptive of the assumptions to use, And here is a summary of the main principles which we need to use when setting the assumptions. The assumptions need to be best estimate and unbiased. They need to be mutually compatible. So, for example, as an assumption, for example, an assumption made for future salary increase should be compatible with the assumption made for inflation, assuming salaries are generally expected to maintain value in real terms, they linked to the inflation. Also, they need to reflect market expectation over the period. The obligations are settled. This places a tight margins around what we can reasonably adopt for the assumptions for inflation and discount rates for the purpose of the accounting calculation. But whilst there is a prescription, there is some variation between employers, for example, different future cash flow profiles or duration of cash flows, as we call it. This will mean different market data will be used to set the assumption. But also there does tend to be some wiggle room within each assumption. We'll touch on this a bit later in our training. Sorry. There's probably one more thing to note, which is quite important, and it's that the assumptions are the responsibility of the directors and not us, the actuaries. Although in practice, employers mainly rely on our advice, and we kind of provide our suggestion advice to employers, and then employers kind of instruct us to use those assumptions for the purpose of the accounting. Let's move to the next slide and talk a bit more about the discount rate and how we set this for the accounting. So the most significant assumptions prescribed by the accounting standard is the discount rate. The discount rate must reflect the yield on high quality AA rated corporate bonds. In effect, the accounting standards requires you to assume you will be investing all the fund's money in corporate bonds and achieving returns in line with the yield on those bonds. The tracker chart on the right of this slide shows how corporate bond yields have fallen persistently over the last 10 years or so. And this market movement has alone broadly doubled accounting liability valuation over this period. You remember, the lower the discount rate, the higher the value of the liabilities. This is in sharp contrast to how pension funding works, as we talked in our previous section. In the real world, when we set the valuation assumption, where the discount rate is based on the expected returns on the fund's asset, and then we kind of apply a level of prudence around that. And I mentioned before that for the funding purposes, we set a discount rate or investment return, which we think the fund has a 75% probability of achieving. So that's the chance of the return being as predicted based on the asset expected to be held by the fund. And based on the current market condition, that might give us a discount rate for funding purposes, which is around 2% per annum higher than the corporate bond yields used for the accounting valuation. So for most employers, the accounting deficit will be a lot higher than the outcome of their funding valuation, and the current service cost materially higher than the primary rate of contribution certified in the valuation. So it is very unlikely that an accounting deficit will go away anytime soon. Sorry to say that, simply due to the different methods used to set the discount rates in both exercises. And that concludes my brief introduction to the pension accounting and the pension liabilities. I will now pass over to Sam to continue the session. However, I will now ask whether there are any questions. Right, so I'll pass over to Sam.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Eric. So Eric's talked about the background pensions accounting there, how we calculate liability values at valuations, which are then rolled forward annually for accounting purposes. So I'll now talk a bit about our process, including our suite of reports that we produce in respect of pensions accounting, and talk in finer detail about how that roll forward works and some of the numbers that go into the accounting results schedules that we produce for each employer. So looking at our reports first then, our process works as follows. So in the early part of the year, we produce our terms of reference. That sets out the process that we're going to follow for the year, including what we will do as standard for each employer, what additional options are available or additional work that could be required. We ask employers to complete an employer requirements spreadsheet, which gathers information on what we need to allow for in our calculations. So for multi-academy trust, that is often information on any academies joining the trust over the year. That's all collated by West Yorkshire Pension Funds Administering Authority and then passed back to us. It's worth noting that the West Yorkshire Pension Fund is unitised, which means that we track assets at employer level on a monthly basis. So we're able to pick up the assets for each individual employer at the accounting date and allow for cash flows affecting the liabilities over the accounting period, using all the information we're given by the administering authority to do that unitisation process. Shortly after the accounting date, we provide our assumptions advice that Eric's mentioned, and that sets out all the assumptions that we'll use as standard at the accounting date. And as Eric alluded to, I'll talk a bit more about the assumption setting process later on. We then carry out our calculations and we produce an individual employer results schedule for each employer. And that sets out all the relevant figures for pensions accounting, plus a covering report, which sets out all the supplementary information. So I would suggest that you read all of those reports. You should all get copies as part of this accounting exercise. That will give a much greater level of detail than we're able to go through today, just due to time. But what I will do now is spend some time talking about the employer results schedule and the numbers that go into that report. Before I do though, one final point, it does cause some confusion at times with employers, but generally our work is done via the administering authority. They are our client, the pension fund is our client, and so therefore in most cases all correspondence should go through them, and that includes questions from your auditors. We do, however, offer a scheme employer service, which means that someone else at Aon, so not one of us advising the pension fund, but another Aon colleague could contact you to help you with the accounting process if you want, and that can either run alongside or instead of this main accounting process. If that is of interest, then please let us know and we can arrange for someone from our advisory team to contact you directly. So moving on to the results schedule then. It consists of an opening section, which includes comments on the results, section 1, which contains the draft disclosure note setting out all the numbers, section 2, which shows a projected profit and loss account for the future years, section 3, which shows the sensitivity of the liability figure and the projected current service cost to changes in assumptions, and then finally section 4, which sets out a summary of the data used in our calculations. So starting with that opening section, the comments generally appear on page 2 of our report, as shown in the bottom left of the slide on the screen. So that sets out some general comments around how assets have performed over the accounting period, what's happened to the assumptions and what that means for the accounting position, any scheme-wide or significant occurrences or requirements for the accounting period, and then also any comments specific to the employer in question, such as comments on the data provided or any significant events that we've been asked to include. So again, in multi-academy trust, that might be a new academy joining over the period. Section 1 of the results schedule then starts with a summary of the assumptions used and a summary of the breakdown of assets, along with confirmation of the balance sheet position. So that's the assets, the liabilities or defined benefit obligation, and the net position. And that's shown at this accounting date and at the previous accounting date. The rest of section 1 then shows how we've got to that balance sheet position at this accounting date based on where we were a year ago. The first tables on the next page of the results schedule are the profit and loss account and comprehensive income. And so the key items in those two sections that will be applicable to most employers are the current service cost, which is the cost to the employer of new benefits accruing over the year. And as Eric mentioned, that's based on accounting assumptions. It's broadly calculated as the salary for the employer over the year, multiplied by the employer contribution rate calculated using those accounting assumptions, which, as Eric's mentioned, is going to lead to much higher costs than on the funding basis. And that does mean that that current service cost is generally much higher than the employer contributions being paid over the period. The next item is the interest on net defined liability or asset. So that's the interest on the liabilities over the year, so the unwind of the discount rate, less interest on the assets if we were to assume that assets had a return in line with the discount rate. We then have the assets gains or losses, and what this shows is the outperformance of the fund assets over the year compared with that discount rate that we were expecting. And then finally, liability gains and losses, which shows the changes in the liabilities over the year as a result of changes in the actuarial assumptions and experience versus the start year assumptions. So under IS 19, that's broken down into 3 items, but for FRS 102, which almost all of you will report under, is combined into 1 item called liability gains and losses. So I'm not going to talk about past service costs, curtailments, settlements, or surplus restrictions, which do appear in those 2 tables that I've put on the screen. And that's because those are generally less common items, particularly for academies. And we wanted to try and keep this training as general as possible. If you do have any questions on any of that, though, or if that is applicable to you, then please do contact the administrative authority and they can pass on any questions to us. So in section 1, the next thing we're doing is looking at a reconciliation of liabilities. So i.e. how we've got to the accounting date liability figure based on the liability figure we had at the previous accounting date. As we've already talked about, that's done via a roll forward method. So we don't get revised membership data. Instead, we calculate changes to the liability figure over the year, and then we add these all up to get a liability figure at the end of the year. So I've added a chart at the top of this slide which shows that in a graphical form. I've color-coded different items to show what appears in the profit and loss account, which are the red items, what appears in other comprehensive income in grey, and then those that don't impact on the balance sheet because they have an effect on both the liabilities and the assets, so have a net zero impact, and those are shown in dark blue. So what this chart shows then is that generally speaking, the liabilities increase over the year due to accrual of benefits, which can be broken down into the current service cost and employee contributions paid. Some liabilities are extinguished through benefits being paid out over the period. So that's pensions paid, retirement lump sums. There could also be an addition to the liabilities due to individuals being made redundant and being able to retire with unreduced benefits. And then we have interest on all of these items, which is going to add to the liabilities. And then finally, we have those actuarial gains and losses, which can either increase or decrease the liabilities, depending on what's happened to experience and assumptions over the year. And that's all shown in a table in our report, and I've put a screenshot of that in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide. Moving on to the assets then, we then have a similar process for the assets where we start with the assets at the last accounting date. We allow for contributions being paid in, benefits being paid out. We add interest to those items in line with the discount rate, and then we allow for asset returns being higher or lower than the discount rate to get to our asset figure at the end of the period. In practice, though, because the West Yorkshire Pension Fund is unitised, which remember means we have the assets already at the accounting date, which we've calculated monthly using data provided by the Fund Administration Authority, the end asset values for the employers are taken from the unitisation model, and then this reconciliation is backfilled effectively using the calculation method I just described. So again, how that report appears in our report is shown in a table at the bottom of this slide. So the final table in section 1 of our report relates to the actual return on assets, which is essentially the sum of the interest on the assets and the actuarial gain or loss on the assets. So this slide here isn't actually something that we need to show in our report because it's not a disclosure requirement, but I do think it helps to bring together what I've just been talking about. So what this is doing is this is combining the liability and the asset reconciliations, and we're then tracking from the deficit at the start of the period to the deficit at the end of the period. So in short then, we start with the starting deficit figure. add on the profit and loss account in red. We take off the employer contributions paid because that's coming on the asset side, reducing the deficit. And then you add on the other comprehensive income, which, as I said earlier, could be positive or negative, and that gives you your deficit at the end of the accounting period. So the accounting standards, they separate out the other comprehensive income, those items in grey. And the reason for doing that is because that's where most of the volatility appears in the reconciliation. As I noted, that could be positive or negative any year, depending on conditions. So what that then means is that the profit and loss figures in red, they stay broadly stable from year to year. Okay, moving on to excuse me, the rest of our report then. Sections 2 and 3 are hopefully pretty self-explanatory. The projected figures and the sensitivities, they're required under IAS 19. And whilst sensitivity figures aren't strictly required under FRS 102, it is best practice, which is why we show those as standard. Section 4 then, I'll just go through in a bit of detail. So it sets out, firstly, a summary of the membership data at the last valuation, which remember is used to calculate valuation results and then used in our accounting roll forward year to year. And we split that between the different membership categories, so active members, deferred members, pensioners and dependents. It shows a summary of the cash flow data that we were provided with and the final cash flow data we've used if we've had to make any estimation for missing data. Generally, where we do have to estimate data, our approach is to simply rate up the cash flows. So if we were using 10 months of actual data, we would multiply the figures given by 12/10 to estimate the contribution figures for the year. This section also sets out a summary of the calculated salary roll for this year and the previous year. And the reason for that is that we don't get provided with this information. So it's something that we generally calculate by taking the employer contribution paid over the year and then dividing through by the expected employer contribution rate over the period to give an implied salary for the year for that employer. And then it also shows a summary of the unitised notional asset holding for the employer and the asset return that has been earned by the West Yorkshire Pension Fund over the accounting period. And again, I've shown screenshots from each of those 4 sections on the slide. So final bit on this small section then, as I'm sure you're all aware, you need to enter your pensions accounting information into the Academy's accounts return for the year. To help you do this, there is guidance provided by the Department for Education. And that guidance includes a scan of one of our results schedules, which is shown in the bottom right. Although just note that the colour scheme is changed since the version that they used. It still looks the same. The report is just different colours. And that scan that they've got, that has a key of where each item fits into the accounts return. So you can see that in the blue text that's highlighted with circle around it in the bottom. And all that's doing is telling you where to take the numbers from in our report and where to put them into that return that you need to do. And I've put a link actually on this slide in red in the top left. So when you get the copy of the slides, you'll be able to use that link if you need to go and find that guidance from Department for Education. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking about accounting assumptions now, but are there any questions on the reports before I do? No? Okay, no problem. As Alison said earlier, if there is anything that crops up, please feel free to type it in the chat box and I'll try and answer those as we go through. So I'm going to highlight the main topics for setting accounting assumptions this year. I will warn you now, this is going to get quite technical, but these are areas that auditors might ask you about. So it's probably worth covering in this session, but don't worry too much if it doesn't quite make sense. Again, if you want to ask any questions on this in future, then please feel free to. So setting the discount rate then. So firstly, a bit of background on how we do it. As noted earlier, the accounting standards require us to set the discount rate in line with corporate bond yields. They also require us to allow for the estimated timing of the benefit payments when setting the assumptions. So that's all well and good, but when you look at corporate bonds, the yield, so the return on a corporate bond, actually varies by the length of the bond. So, for example, a corporate bond that had a redemption date in 1 year's time offers a different yield to a corporate bond that offers a redemption date in 10 years' time. So what we have to do then is we have to map a relationship between the bond yields and the term to redemption in what's called a yield curve. And then what we're able to do with this yield curve is we're able to calculate a weighted average discount rate based on the cash flows that we're expecting to pay out for a specific employer. So the chart on the left-hand side there shows our yield curves at 31st of August 2021 in green and then 31st of August 2020 in blue. So with that background in mind, the main reason for talking about this today is that we have actually made a change to how we calculate those yield curves this year. So what we've done is we've moved from to a different subset of bonds that we use in formulating our yield curve. So last year we used what's called our select yield curve, which includes bonds that were AA rated by at least 2 of the 3 main rating agencies. This year, however, we've moved to expand the number of bonds. So we're now only looking at bonds that are rated AA by 1 of the rating agencies as a minimum, and that's called our single agency curve. So this is a change in approach, and it's something the auditors may ask you about, in which case this is all explained in our assumptions paper, so you can point them towards that. If they require any more details, then please let us know and we'll be happy to discuss it with them. I should note that actually at this accounting date, it makes barely any difference to the answer. So it's good that we're including more people in there now to get, more bonds in there to get a better range of information when setting our yield curve. But actually the change in the discount rate at the 31st of August 2021 is 0.01%. So it is really quite marginal. It has a very, very slight difference in the liability and current service costs reported at this accounting date. They're very slightly lower, but hopefully that shouldn't be an issue. And it has been cleared with auditors, but just be aware it is something you may get asked about, as it is something different to what we did last year. Moving on then to the CPI assumptions, this is probably the more contentious change this year. So the industry standard for setting the CPI assumption for accounting purposes to start by looking at inflation rates priced into the gilts market. So that's known as break-even inflation because it's the inflation rate that would need to be paid by an index-linked gilt to give you the same overall return as a fixed interest gilt, noting that currently index-linked gilts pay RPI inflation. It is, however, commonly accepted that the gilts market tends to overestimate inflation, mainly due to supply and demand. So we and many other actuaries will make a deduction to allow for this, which gives us a best estimate RPI inflation measure. We then also need to set an assumption for CPI inflation, not RPI inflation, because that's what benefits in the LGPS are linked to. And CPI inflation is usually a lower inflation measure, mainly due to differences in the way that the 2 inflation statistics are calculated. So we then have another deduction applied to our break-even RPI inflation to get down to our CPI inflation assumption. So the key point here is that those 2 deductions I've just mentioned are key actuarial judgments, and those judgments do vary by actuarial firm. Recently, however, the UK Statistics Authority and government have thrown a bit of a spanner in the works, which has upset how we make these judgments. So that spanner in question is RPI reform. And it's because RPI measure is very likely to be reformed from 2030 to bring its calculation method more into line with CPI, or more precisely CPIH. The difference between CPIH and CPI is that CPIH includes housing costs. This was effectively confirmed by the Chancellor's response to his RPI consultation in November 2020. So that was during this accounting period. So it is something that needs to be allowed for. In terms of what that means for how we set our assumption for CPI accounting, on this chart I've shown the top blue curve, which is the market break-even RPI inflation at 31st of August 2021 using gilt prices, as I described earlier. So to convert this to CPI assumption, we first need to take off the expected gap between RPI and CPI, and that would give us the lower orange curve. We believe that in the short term, CPI inflation will be lower than RPI by around 1% per year. So after 2030, we're reducing that gap to about 0.1%. And the reason it's not 0 is that that reflects the difference between CPI and CPIH. So we have discussed that change with auditors and it is generally accepted. Unfortunately, the gilts market doesn't seem to have priced in for RPI inflation to fall once it switches to CPIH post 2030. And you can see that on the graph from the fact that the blue line doesn't drop down in 2030. It still stays at that higher rate of about 3.6, 3.7%. So what that leads then is for a rather strange CPI assumption, the orange line, which steps up in the year 2030. So our view is that there's no reason for CPI inflation expectations to increase at that point. So what that means then is that the market must be overpricing inflation, i.e. that inflation risk premium must have increased at that date. So what we've done to combat that issue is that we've increased our inflation risk premium from 0.2% at the last accounting date to 0.6% at 2030. And we do believe there's strong arguments to support this based on supply and demand factors in the gilts market and then perceived higher inflation risk. So where we end up then for this accounting period is a CPI assumption that is the sort of the yellow dashed line, the third line down in that chart. There's another line on the chart there in grey, and that is Aon's house view on long-term CPI inflation. And we calculate that quarterly as part of our ongoing process. And at 30th of June 2021, that was 2.2%. So that would imply a much greater inflation risk premium than we're proposing for accounting. So the obvious question then is, why are we proposing an assumption for CPI for accounting which is much higher than Aon's long-term view? And the reason comes back to what the accounting standard requires. So as Eric mentioned earlier, they need the assumption to be market consistent. Auditors are generally of the view that inflation risk premium should be fairly stable over time, and they're quite nervous about accepting changes to those assumptions. We do sense that some audit firms are still forming views on this. We've only had to deal with it this year. We've obviously been through a March and a July accounting exercise for other employers in the fund, and there have been a range of different views coming through. So our proposal this year is to make a modest increase in our inflation risk premium from 2030, which we think, based on discussions with auditors already, that they're happy to accept. But you should be under no illusions that having to do this to satisfy the auditors this year has led to quite a big increase in liabilities in some cases for employers. The other point to note is that, as Eric mentioned earlier, the salary increase assumption is linked to CPI inflation. So it's not just the CPI inflation assumption that's increasing, it's also the salary increase assumption. So that's something you might want to consider when looking at our assumptions advice to whether you think that's appropriate for your specific circumstances. So quite a lot going on that. As I mentioned, it has sort of been through the auditors already at 31st of March and 31st of July. Hopefully we shouldn't have any issues coming back from auditors based on the assumptions that we're adopting. But I would note that there's probably some audit firms that we've not yet dealt with this year, just because they mainly specialise in auditing academies. So we will need to wait and see what kind of questions we get back. But we're hoping that we've put our assumptions in a pretty good place that it shouldn't cause any problems with auditors. So moving on to the mortality assumption then. This slide is very similar to something that Eric showed earlier in the first session, where he noted that there have been around 92,500 excess deaths since the start of the pandemic, based on figures released by the CMI. The one thing to add to this, I guess, as part of accounting, is that as part of our accounting assumption setting, we look at the future mortality improvement tables produced by the CMI each year, and we assess whether moving to those future improvement tables would have a significant impact on the accounting figures or not. As Eric noted, CMI's latest improvement model, CMI 2020, they've elected to exclude the impact of deaths over 2020 from their calculations. So the result is that actually using that latest improvement model would give very similar liability values based on compared to the assumptions we used last year, and then also at the 2019 valuations. Again, this slide is something that Eric talked about earlier, where he noted that there was a study carried out by Aon for another LGPS fund. The key point from this is that the impact of COVID deaths over that year to the end of February 2021 was only around 0.1% on liabilities. And it would be surprising if other funds, including the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, were seeing a material impact from COVID-19 deaths. So in our accounting assumptions this year, we have not made any allowance for COVID-19 experience over the year. So the overall message from those two slides on mortality is that the mortality assumptions are unchanged from last year, and we're not making any special allowance for excess deaths. So actually the impact of mortality compared to the start of the period is essentially zero. Okay, so the next section is on LGPS developments, each of which Alison's already mentioned from a funding point of view, but I just will pick up on any impact on accounting. Before I do, any questions coming in? I can't see anything in the chat at the moment, so unless anyone has anything they want to ask, I'll carry on. Okay. So firstly, MCLEOD. As I said, Alison's already talked through this in quite a bit of detail, so I won't go over the background again. But we do need to allow for MCLEOD in the accounting liabilities. It's something that the auditors have been very keen on. So the allowance at the valuation was quite broad brush, as Alison mentioned. And whilst it identified an approximate additional contribution that would be required to the fund to fund MCLEOD, which was 0.9% of pay, it didn't calculate the liability at employer level. So as part of the accounting work done in 2020 for all employers, we carried out a more accurate calculation, though still approximate as we didn't have all the necessary data at that stage. And we have calculated an approximate MCLEOD liability for each employer, and that was added to the accounting liabilities and also the cost of benefits accruing over 2020. So in terms of impacts this year, there's no additional impact on the accounting figures, as we've already allowed for the key elements of the government's proposed remedy last year. And because this year's figures are a roll forward from last year, that addition last year is kind of carried on then for any future roll forwards. There is also an allowance baked into the current service cost, meaning that any accrual of MCLEOD liability over the last year is also picked up as part of our roll forward. So we're not expecting to revisit MCLEOD anytime before the next valuation for accounting purposes. So we don't anticipate needing to make any additional allowance in the 2022 accounting figures either, other than what's already baked into that roll forward. Moving on to Goodwin then. So again, Alison has mentioned this earlier and talked about how it wasn't allowed for in the 2019 valuations. So it isn't automatically allowed for in our accounting figures either. There's quite a lot of information on this slide. I'm not actually going to talk through very much of it at all. But what I will say is that we carried out some calculations on an accounting basis for a sample LGPS fund last year. We drilled down to employer level. And the purpose of that was to help us form some decisions on whether we thought it was going to be an impact for employers' accounting liabilities. So whilst there was an outlier in our calculations, which can be seen on the chart here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm circling the one outlier in the left-hand chart. That was an outlier, and actually we'd expect for the vast majority of employers the impact to be between 0.1 and 0.2% of liabilities. So given that small liability and the cost of calculating the figure at employer level, including some estimations needed to the data, we've not elected to include a liability for Goodwin in our standard reporting this year. It is something we can do if employers want us to. So it can be included as an add-on, but just note that there are some quite large costs involved because of the amount of work required to calculate that number. So if that is something that you're interested in, or your auditor comes back and says that they'd like to know more about, then please contact your usual contact at West Yorkshire Pension Fund, and they'll be able to refer that on to us. So the other item, again, something that Alison covered earlier, is GMP equalisation indexation. So the good news on this one is that we've already allowed for full indexation, so i.e. pension increases on benefits being equal to CPI for individuals reaching state pension age after 5th of April 2021. So that's already been allowed for in the employer accounting last year. And again, that's then, as part of the roll forward, included in this year's figures. There's also this Lloyds Bank case, which I'm not going to talk about in detail because we don't even know if that's going to apply to LGPS funds yet. But what I will say is, based on some experience from investigations in the private sector, it's unlikely to lead to material payments being made, and so we're not expecting it to have a big impact on liabilities. It might be something that auditors pick up with you again. I think we've seen 1 or 2 questions on it so far out of about 400 or so employers that we've already produced accounting figures for this year. So if it is something that's picked up, then again, feel free to pass it on to the administrative authority, who can then refer it to us. But hopefully it won't be something that we need to deal with this year. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit there about the background to what we do, what some of the numbers mean, how the results are formed, how we derive our assumptions. These next 2 sections I'm going to talk through, set out what's happened over the accounting period, what that means for accounting results in general as at 31st of August 2021. So firstly, looking at some general trends in markets over the year. So starting with the assets, again, this is something similar to what Eric presented earlier in the first session, but I have stopped this one at 31st of August 2021 to time with the accounting date for everyone on the call. Obviously, the messages are very similar to what Eric said earlier. So asset returns have bounced back really well from the low in March 2020, and the return on the West Yorkshire Pension Fund since the 2019 valuation up to 31st of August 2021 was about 23%. So that's slightly higher than the figure Eric showed you earlier, because his chart was going up to the end of September and returns did take a little bit of a drop off in September. In terms of your accounting figures, though, we're not actually looking at what's happened since the 2019 valuation. We want to look at what's happened since last year's accounting figures. So moving on to the next slide. I've rebased this chart then to start at a point of 0, which is effectively 31st of August 2020. And that shows that asset returns have been very positive on average over the last year, with equities, which are the sort of royal blue, I guess, line at the top, and the orange line, showing really strong returns. And for West Yorkshire Pension Fund, we don't have the exact figures yet, but we think returns over that period have been about 21% for the year. At the last accounting date, the discount rate was around 1.7%. So that means that assets have outperformed the discount rate. And that 21% asset return equates to a gain over the year of about 19% on the funding position, with all else being equal. Looking at the implied financial assumption changes then, worth noting before I talk through this slide that these charts are purely based on market data before any manipulation by us. So whilst it doesn't show the exact assumptions we're using, it gives a good direction of travel. So starting with the discount rate then in the top left of the slide. Remember, as we've talked about already, this has to be based on corporate bond yields. That's prescribed by the accounting standard. And the chart from the top left is something that Eric showed earlier, where he noted that corporate bond yields and therefore accounting discount rates have been falling for some time. So it's not easy to tell from that chart what the figures are at the last accounting date, this accounting date. So in the top right hand section of the slide, I've zoomed in on that little section there, and that shows that the corporate bond yield would have been around 1.6% at 31st of August 2020. But that has increased to about 1.65% as at 31st of August 2021, based on market data. So that suggests that there could be a very small increase in the discount rate this year. I mean, it is minimal though, so it's going to have a very small impact on the accounting liabilities. Looking at inflation then, again, remember that drives the pension increase assumption. So again, I've produced a chart in the bottom right this time of the slide, this time just looking over the last year. And what that shows is that at 31st of August 2020, market implied break-even RPI inflation was about 3%, whereas by 31st of August 21, that had increased to around 3.4%. So an increase of around 0.4% based on market data. Higher pension increase assumption leads to a higher liability value. And so therefore that on its own would increase the liabilities and the current service cost by about 10%, we think. So what is suggesting then is that market changes mean that assumption changes are probably going to lead to an increase in liabilities over the year. And I will come on, obviously, to our exact assumptions a bit later on in this session. So I already mentioned earlier in the session that we weren't changing our mortality assumption. So the final piece of the story then, in terms of what's happened over the year, relates to the pay and pension increase experience. For pay increases, we're not provided with individual membership data for our accounting calculations. That would lead to much more work, much longer turnaround and higher costs. And it's not something that we can estimate with confidence over the year. We wouldn't expect pay rises on average to have been higher than assumed, but it wouldn't really be appropriate for us to place a value on what those pay increases might have been. So our general approach as part of our accounting calculations then is to make no allowance for pay increase experience. So assume that actual pay rises have been equal to our assumption. Again, if this is something that that doesn't really work for you, if you know that your pay increases have been zero, for example, over the year, then you can request that we allow for that. We can give you an idea of the impact, whether or not it's going to have a significant impact on your figures. So something to consider and discuss with auditors. Pension increases, however, we are able to do something on. We do know what those have been because the increase awarded at each April is linked to published CPI for the previous September. So the increase at April 2021, so in this accounting period, was 0.5%, whereas our assumption last year, we expected the next increase to be about 2.3% for an average employer. That impacts on the deferred and pensioner liabilities, but also the care benefits accrued by active members under the 2014 scheme. The amount that it impacts on the liabilities for any given employer is going to vary depending on the actual assumption adopted last year and the employer profile. So, for example, an employer with a large proportion of non-active liabilities is generally going to be more impacted than an employer with mostly pre-2014 active liabilities. But on average, we've calculated that this has probably reduced accounting liabilities by around 1% for employers. So let's put that all in context then and look at indicative accounting results. Some of you have obviously going to have already had your results, although I think it's only a few that actually requested it before now. So this should coincide with what you're seeing in those results. And the rest of you that will be getting your results towards the end of the month, this should act as a bit of a heads up of what to expect. Okay, firstly, then looking at the assumptions, I talked earlier about the market trends, general direction of travel, and as you'd expect, our proposed assumptions are largely in line with those market changes. So I've shown the key financial assumptions at 31st of August 2020 and 2021 for an average employer of a duration of 25 years, which is the typical average for an academy or multi-academy trust. So at 2020, we had a discount rate of 1.7% and a pension increase assumption of 2.3%, and that gives a net discount rate, which is the difference between the discount rate and the pension increase assumption, of minus 0.6%. At August 2021, we have a discount rate of 1.7%, so there's no change there. But as sort of suggested by the market data, the pension increase assumption is increased. It's actually increased to 2.6%. So our net discount rate has gone from minus 0.6 down to minus 0.9, a reduction of 0.3%, meaning that the liabilities calculated this year will be higher than those reported at 2020. And a rough rule of thumb would suggest that increase might be around 8%. Next year's current service cost will also increase, possibly by slightly more, just because of the profile of active members versus the whole of the employer. So we've estimated that to be about 9% compared to the figure being reported this year. So adding up all the movements then on the liability side due to changes in assumptions, experience, allowing for interest on the liabilities, we've calculated for an average employer, the liabilities have increased compared with 31st of August 2020 by around 9%. On the asset side, I noted earlier on that asset returns have been around 21%. So we are seeing a bigger increase in assets than in liabilities. However, as I think Eric mentioned earlier, accounting positions have been in deficit for quite a while. We don't particularly expect that to change. So whilst the assets have increased by more than the liabilities, with the liabilities being higher than the assets, we're probably not going to see that much of an improvement in the net deficit. So results will vary by employer due to different employer profiles, but overall we're probably expecting most employers' net balance sheet position to be about the same as that reported last year. There might be some that have improved slightly, some that are a bit worse, but on average probably very similar to last year. Okay, the final section I've got here then is just to talk about some common auditor questions. Does anybody want to ask a question before I move on? No, there's nothing in the chat, so I'll get this finished then, and then there will be some time for questions at the end if anyone has any. So I'll just run through then the areas, I guess, that we expect auditors to focus on, and that's based on sort of our experience of what's happened in the past couple of years, but also from these discussions that we have with auditors on an annual basis and what we've heard them asking about at 31st of March and 31st of July. So we've got 5 items there. The most common one that we get as part of the audit testing is how we've calculated the assets, and in particular, what asset return we've used. And the main reason for that is that often, so not so much for the employers on the call, but at sort of March and at July in particular, I suppose, employers want figures before the asset returns have been finalised. So there's about a month to 6-week lag in getting the actual investment returns after the accounting date. And so if employers want their accounting figures before that date, we have to use an estimated asset return for the remaining month or 2 months. And we do that by using market indices in line with what the fund invests in. Those aren't going to be exactly the same as what the fund actually earns over that period, because they're invested in different type of assets where market indices aren't always available, but it gives a pretty good idea of what those returns are going to be. So the auditors will sometimes look at the figures sort of 3 to 4 months down the line when we do know what the asset returns are. And so their question often is, why is the return you've used not equal to this actual return that the fund has seen? So generally what we do to combat this is number one, if the difference is big, we can obviously redo the figures using the actual asset return. Alternatively, and what I believe a lot of the academies on the call have elected to do this year, is that you have your accounting figures from us a little bit later and you wait until the final asset return is known. Next item is special movements, special events. So auditors generally want to know if there's been any events over the year which we've not been informed about. We only allow for anything that you ask us to include. So if there's been anything that's occurred over the year that you're telling your auditors that we've not been told about, then the auditor might be questioning that, and they might ask for the materiality of that event and ask us to do an analysis to figure out whether or not that needs to be allowed for in your accounting figures. Generally speaking, for academies, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the big thing is an academy joining the multi-academy trust. And we do have a list of all the academies that join multi-academy trusts over the year, so we are able to get that information. But if there is anything else that crops up, then please do tell us as part of that employer requirement sheet that I mentioned at the beginning of this session. The next thing is source data. So we've seen an increase in testing of source data in recent years. So basically the marrying up of the data that we've used in our calculations and the data held by the administrative authority. And some auditors have started asking us for underlying membership records. That's not something that we're able to provide because it's not our data to give, although we are often provided with cuts of the fund's data for other purposes, such as the actuarial valuation. What we would say, though, is it's worth querying with the auditors what they're aiming to test when they're asking for that full membership data, and to understand if there's an alternative way for them to get comfortable with the figures rather than carrying out all that extra work and getting that extra information. The next item is the CPI assumption. As you could probably tell, given the amount of detail I went into on that earlier, it is a bit of a contentious issue this year. We've already been through a round of negotiations with auditors as part of the March exercise. So as I said, I think we're in a pretty good position now. We hopefully won't get many queries on this. but there are 4 different firms of actuaries in the LGPS market space, multiple auditors, each of which unfortunately has slightly different views. And we don't know the full range of those views at this point in time. It's a very complex area, so we tried to pitch that assumption in a sensible place, but we'll just have to wait and see if any auditors come back with any queries on any of that. And then finally, we've seen some questions on whether the impact of COVID has been allowed for in the mortality assumptions. And hopefully those couple of slides that I talked through earlier showing that the impact we think has been very, very small. It will help you sort of fend off the question from the auditors. But again, if you need something from us, then send the request into the administrative authority. You can refer it on to us and we can come back with something formal to hopefully satisfy your auditors. So that is everything. I think we're doing okay for time. We've got about 10 minutes of the session left. Does anybody have any questions on any of the accounting session that Eric and I have gone through, or indeed any questions on the earlier session? Happy to answer those now. Just to reiterate, this has been recorded, this session, and you will get a copy of the slides. So if there's anything that you're not willing to say now, but you want to have a look at the recording or look through the slides and come back with any questions later on, then please feel free to do so. I'll just pause for a second in case anyone wants to ask anything. No, okay, no problem. Well, I hope that's been helpful and informative. Caroline, was there anything you wanted to say before we end the session?
No, that's great. Thank you very much for your time, Sam. And as I say, as you've mentioned, if anybody has any questions, if you want to come back to any of the team at West Yorkshire, we can obviously try and answer them, or we can find out more information from Aon if we need to. That's it. Thank you very much for joining.